Greetings, disciple groups. It's good to be with you for another week of Lent. We're thinking about holiness this season of Lent and how we can invite God to do a new work in our hearts and our lives, draw us closer to Himself, to look more like Him in our life. And so I hope God is doing something new and great in your life. Today we're talking about Colossians chapter 3, looking at verses 5 through 9. I trust you read them already. But in those verses, if you haven't, then stop the video and read them. I want to kind of be short on my time, so I'm not going to read them for you. But in those verses, maybe you notice that Paul in Colossians chapter 3, in talking about holiness, is going to use two images for our life. He's going to talk about our life before Jesus and our life after or with Jesus. As Paul talks about our old life, the life before Christ, he talks about this life as a life characterized by sin. And this new life in Christ is a life that's characterized by fullness of life in Jesus. And so Paul wants to make the point to us here in 5 through 9 is that when we enter into this new life with Christ, we must separate from this old life of sin. That in order to embrace fullness of life with Jesus, we have to we have to kill the sin of this old life. And the reason for that is that sin threatens fullness of life in Christ. Sin will prevent us from living in the fullness of life that Jesus wants with you and with me. And so Paul tells us to destroy the sin. And he has good reason to say that. Sin, as I heard Andy Stanley once say, sin is one of those things that destroys. He said it this way. He said, with every sin, there is a pleasure and a payment. With every sin, there is a pleasure or a promise. That sin promises to do something to fill your cup. It promises to give you something, and it's attractive, so it lures you in, but it also costs you something. And so we look at sin in that way, and there's an image I think that might be kind of helpful to us in this regard. I've got a cup here. I hope you can see it. It's about halfway full of water, and this cup kind of represents our life. I think many of us, we feel like we have blessings in our life, and yet there's this desire for more, and we were created for that sense of more. The question is, what do we do to try and fill the rest of our cup? What do we run to, right? Well, in the old life, the life of sin, maybe we ran to certain things, thinking that there are things I'm going to do. Maybe, sex in whatever way I want to achieve it. Sexual immorality, lust. Maybe these things will help fill my cup. And we know that there's a pleasure with those, right? There's something we gain from it. But the reality is it's short-lived, right? But it leaves you with a sense of emptiness, right? And so in the end, even what you gain from it begins to be lost because it pokes holes in the cup, right? It leaves you with emptiness. We look at achievement thinking, maybe I can achieve great things. But we find that doesn't fill either, right? We find the ways we go about life and gossiping and hurting other relationships and slandering people that we know that robs trust for other people and in our own relationships. We go to spouses and children for achievement to say, fill me up, fill my cup. And because we put impossible expectations on those relationships, it robs us of fullness rather than giving us a sense of fullness. Paul says when you do these things that he names here, those 10 sins, and in chapter 3, verses 5 through 9, Paul says these things are just going to empty your cup. Instead of filling you up, they will in the end empty you and rob you of the very life that you want and the life that you were made for. See, the problem with sin is that sin empties the cup. It never fills. It promises to fill, but it can't. It can't give you and I the satisfaction we were created to know. It will empty the cup. And this is why Paul says we have to kill the sin in our life. Because sin will not fill your cup, it will empty your cup. And sin will destroy you. And that's why Paul says we must destroy our sin. We have to kill our sin before our sin kills us. Now, the other side of that Paul represents is our life in Christ. And Paul says, here's what Jesus offers us. We have the same cup, right, that has need to be filled, room to be filled with something. And here's what Paul says happens when we come to Jesus. What happens is that Jesus begins to pour his life into us. John chapter 1, verse 16 says it this way: out of the fullness of Christ, we have received grace upon grace. In other words, Jesus continues to pour out his life upon us, to heap his life upon us in such abundance that our cups begin to overflow and that our cups are filled. And that the promise of Christ to fill our cup is one that he follows through on, and he's able to do it and willing. And Paul says this is the kind of life Jesus wants for you, a life of fullness with him. We think about this life, and to gain this life of fullness is a life of intimacy and coming to God and allowing him to do works in us to separate us from the things that threaten to take that life away. If you want fullness of life in Jesus, then you got to stop poking holes in your cup. You got to quit running to the sins in your life, maybe the old sins that have become patterns. You got to reject those for a new life with Jesus. And that's a process. It is. And that's why we're here in these groups talking about our life and hopefully getting real about the sin in our life and asking God to do something new in us. But it means for us rejecting this old life and embracing a new life with Christ. In the early church in baptism, converts who were coming to be baptized would have this routine where they would face the east, which was a symbol of darkness, and it was where the sun set, of sin and the work of the enemy. And they would actually spit in that direction as a sign of rejection of this old life. And as they turned to the west, a place that represented light and life with God, they would confess or profess obedience to Jesus. It was a turning away from this life and an embracing of the new. And that was to be lived out on a daily basis. And so for you, what does it look like for you today to turn from this life and embrace your new life with Christ? Prayers for you and blessings as you seek to do this. May Jesus fill your cup. May you experience fullness of life with him. Thank you.